Hi, friends. Welcome back to True Crime Echoes. I'm so glad you're here with me today. Now, we often look back at the 1960s as a time of peace, love, and music, a golden age where 500,000 people could come together in a muddy field at Woodstock and still believe in the power of unity. But history has a darker side, and sometimes it hides in plain sight. Tonight, I want to take you to Altamont Speedway in 1969. What was supposed to be the West Coast's answer to Woodstock turned into something far more sinister. A free concert by the Rolling Stones ended in chaos, violence, and the murder of an 18-year-old boy named Meredith Hunter right in front of the stage. This is the story of how one night destroyed the dream of an entire decade, and how Altamont became a symbol of the end of innocence in American culture. So sit back, take a breath, and let's step into the darkness together. Chapter 1. The Dream of Woodstock. When people think of the late 1960s, they often imagine peace signs, flower crowns, and music festivals where everyone came together to celebrate love and freedom. And honestly, that picture isn't too far off. Woodstock in 1969 was one of those rare cultural moments that seemed to capture the spirit of an entire generation. Hundreds of thousands of young people gathered on a muddy farm in upstate New York, and despite the lack of food toilets, or even enough space to sit down, they called it a miracle of peace. Somehow, through all the chaos, it worked. For many, Woodstock felt like proof that music could be bigger than politics, that it could unify people in a time when the world was torn apart by war and civil unrest. It wasn't just a concert, it was a statement. People walked away from it believing they had witnessed the birth of something new, almost sacred. And in the aftermath, there was this hunger to do it again, to recreate that same magic. But here's the thing, when something becomes a cultural myth, overnight expectations start to grow. Suddenly, everyone wants to be part of the next Woodstock. The music industry noticed, the press noticed, even the bands noticed. And among them were the Rolling Stones, arguably the biggest rock band in the world at that time, a group already surrounded by controversy and fascination. The Stones had been criticized for their ticket prices, accused of losing touch with the very youth culture that had made them icons. So what better way to redeem themselves than to throw a massive free concert? In their minds, it was the perfect plan. They would give back to their fans, show the world they cared, and maybe even surpass Woodstock itself. It sounded ideal on paper, right? A free concert, the biggest band in the world. A chance for young people to gather again in the name of music and freedom. But what no one realized back then was how fragile that dream really was. The peace of Woodstock wasn't just about the music. It was about timing, luck, and an unspoken willingness from 500,000 strangers to look out for one another. And you can't manufacture that with money or fame. Looking back now, you can see the cracks forming even before a single note was played. The desire to outdo Woodstock wasn't about unity anymore. It was about ego, reputation, and image. And when you mix all that with poor planning, unchecked ambition, and a band trying to polish their legacy, you don't get another Woodstock. You get something far darker. And that's where the story of Altamont begins. Chapter 2. Planning the Woodstock of the West. After Woodstock, the Rolling Stones were under enormous pressure. Critics accused them of being greedy, too focused on making money off their fans. Mick Jagger and the band wanted to change that perception. So in late 1969, they came up with what sounded like a brilliant idea, a free concert on the West Coast. The dream was simple: Woodstock of the West. It would be big, it would be free, and it would prove that the Stones weren't just rock stars chasing profits, but cultural icons who truly understood the spirit of their fans. And of course, it would make headlines around the world. At first, the plan was to host it in San Francisco's Golden Gate Park. That alone would have been perfect open fields, a place already tied to the counterculture. But there was a problem. The city wasn't on board, the permits weren't secured, and the clock was ticking. They had announced the concert before they had even locked down a location. Imagine that, telling hundreds of thousands of people to show up without having an actual place for them to go. By December 1969, only days before the event, the situation turned into a logistical nightmare. The Stones team scrambled to find a venue. The show got moved from Golden Gate Park to Sears Point Raceway, and then at the very last minute, it shifted again to the Altamont Speedway, a dusty, remote racetrack about 60 miles east of San Francisco. Here's where the cracks deepened. The site wasn't ready. The stage was too low, barely a few feet off the ground. The infrastructure, things like bathrooms, food, medical tents, was almost non-existent. Security. Well, instead of hiring professionals, the organizers struck a deal with the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. They paid them $500 worth of beer to keep the peace. Now think about that for a second. 500,000 people expected to show up, the world's biggest rock band at the height of their fame. And the only security was a group of bikers fueled by alcohol with no real training and a reputation for violence. Looking back, it feels like the setup for a tragedy. But at the time, people were still clinging to the idea of another Woodstock. They wanted to believe in the dream that music could erase conflict, that peace and love could win out again. And so, despite all the warning signs, the concert moved forward. Altamont was supposed to be a celebration. Instead, it was about to expose the dark side of the very culture it claimed to represent. Chapter 3. A Gathering Gone Wrong. On December 6, 1969, the gates of Altamont Speedway opened and the scene was overwhelming. Some say close to 300,000 people flooded in an ocean of humanity, stretching as far as the eye could see. At first glance, it looked like another Woodstock young people draped in blankets, passing around food, smoking, laughing, waiting for the music to begin. But underneath the surface, things already felt off. The racetrack wasn't designed for a gathering like this. The ground was rocky and uneven, the facilities were basically non-existent, and the stage sat absurdly low, just a few feet off the dirt. It meant that the crowd pressed right up against the performers with no real barrier. And then there were the Hells Angels. They didn't look or act like peacekeepers. They lined the stage with their bikes, drinking the beer they'd been paid with, already on edge. Some carried pool cues, chains, and knives. They weren't there to calm the crowd, they were there to dominate it. And the audience could feel it. The vibe was tense. Throughout the day, the atmosphere shifted from uneasy to downright hostile. Smaller acts took the stage first: Santana, Jefferson Airplane, the Flying Burrito Brothers. Every performance was punctuated by fights breaking out in the crowd. People stumbled away bloodied, and the Angels only escalated things. At one point, Marty Balin of Jefferson Airplane tried to intervene when he saw violence erupting near the stage. He ended up getting knocked unconscious by the very men who were supposed to provide security. The scene was so chaotic that even other musicians noticed the energy spiraling. Grace Slick famously described it as bad vibes from the beginning. It wasn't just the Angels. The sheer lack of organization made everything worse. Food and water were scarce, bathrooms impossible to find, and medical help nearly non-existent. People were fainting, dehydrated, or getting crushed at the front of the stage. Instead of peace and love, Altamont felt like survival. By the time the sun began to set and the Rolling Stones prepared to take the stage, the crowd was restless. The Angels were drunk and aggressive, and the dream of a West Coast Woodstock was already in shambles. What no one realized then was that the night was about to take a turn from chaos into tragedy. Chapter 4. The Stones Take the Stage. As night fell over Altamont, a strange electricity buzzed through the air. The Rolling Stones finally stepped onto that tiny stage, and for a moment, the crowd erupted with excitement. After hours of tension, exhaustion, and chaos, here was the payoff everyone had been waiting for: the biggest band in the world, livin' for free. But almost immediately the music collided with the violence simmering just below the surface. The band launched into Sympathy for the Devil, and instead of uniting the audience, the song seemed to ignite the chaos. Fights broke out everywhere, pockets of screaming, shoving, and bloodshed. The Hells Angels, already drunk and agitated, waded into the crowd, swinging pool cues and fists, their aggression escalating with every note. From the stage, Mick Jagger tried to control the scene. He begged the crowd to calm down his voice, carrying over the mic. "Everybody, just be cool out there." But his words fell flat. He looked terrified, glancing over his shoulder as he sang, because even the band wasn't safe. At one point, an angel climbed onto the stage and shoved musicians aside like they were nothing. The low stage meant there was no separation, no safety. Fans who pushed forward were met with fists, kicks, and worse. The angels weren't acting like guards. They were acting like predators. Musicians later said they could feel the dread building as if something was about to break. And yet the Stones kept playing. Maybe out of fear, maybe out of duty, maybe because they thought the music could calm the madness. But the truth was, the music wasn't soothing anyone. It was amplifying the frenzy. Every strum of the guitar, every pounding beat of the drums seemed to mix with the screaming and the violence. The concert wasn't about peace anymore. It had become a battle between sound and chaos, and the band was caught right in the middle. No one realized it at that moment, but the night was about to cross a line that could never be uncrossed. Altamont wasn't just spiraling, it was headed straight toward tragedy. Chapter 5. The Breaking Point. The chaos at Altamont reached its peak during Under My Thumb. By then, the crowd was restless, the angels were out of control, and the Stones were just trying to make it through their set. And that's when tragedy struck. In the middle of the madness was an 18-year-old kid named Meredith Hunter. He had come to the show with his girlfriend, just like thousands of others who believed they were about to witness a moment of musical history. But instead, Meredith's name would forever be tied to Altamont's darkest chapter. Accounts differ about what exactly led to it. Some say Meredith tried to push closer to the stage. Others recall the angels shoving him, beating him back, just like they had done with so many fans that night. But here's the detail that no one could ignore. Meredith had a gun. Witnesses remember him pulling it out after being attacked, maybe out of fear, maybe out of desperation. And in that split second, the dream of peace and love shattered. A Hell's Angel named Alan Pissarro lunged at Meredith. In front of 500,000 people, Pissarro stabbed him repeatedly right there in the chaos by the stage. It was all caught on film. The documentary crew that had been recording the Stones tour, what later became the film Gimme Shelter, captured the exact moment Meredith Hunter's life ended. The grainy footage shows the scuffle, the flash of the gun, the fatal blows. It's haunting to watch, even now. The crowd, already panicked, didn't know what to do. Some people screamed, others tried to help, but most just froze. The music kept going. The Stones, unaware at first of what had happened, pushed through the song, trying to keep the show alive, even as a young man lay dying in front of them. By the time Meredith's body was carried away, it was too late. The festival that was supposed to symbolize free love and unity had ended in murder. And Altamont was no longer a concert, it was a crime scene. Chapter 6. The Aftermath in Real Time. The moment Meredith Hunter was killed, the entire atmosphere shifted. You could feel it, this wasn't just a bad concert anymore. Something inside the crowd broke. People who came for peace, for love, for music were suddenly standing in the middle of a nightmare. I imagine what it must have felt like for those closest to the scene. 1 second you're dancing, trying to ignore the fights and the chaos, and the next you're watching a young man collapse, stabbed to death. The fear must have been suffocating. People whispered, people screamed, but most just stood there, stunned. What's almost unthinkable is that the concert didn't stop. The Stones, shaken and visibly uncomfortable, kept playing. Mick Jagger, glancing nervously at the angels, tried to calm the crowd, begging for peace. But his voice carried no weight anymore. The dream was gone. The audience wasn't listening to the music, they were staring at the violence. Meanwhile, Hell's Angels strutted around the stage, as if they were in control, their bikes revving, fists clenched, ready to swing at anyone who stepped too close. The crowd knew better than to challenge them. People were bleeding, people were crying, but the show went on. And as the band played into the night, Meredith's death became just another part of the chaos. Imagine that a life taken, and yet hundreds of thousands of people stayed rooted in place, too shocked, too afraid, or maybe too caught up in the spectacle to leave. When the final notes echoed across Altamont, there was no applause, no joy, no unity. People shuffled out in silence, stepping over trash, avoiding eye contact, carrying with them the heavy knowledge that they had just witnessed something horrific. The peace and love dream of the 1960s hadn't just ended, it had been violently ripped away. Chapter 7. The Nation Reacts. The morning after Altamont, the headlines didn't celebrate music. They didn't talk about the Rolling Stones' performance or the 500,000 people who came together. Instead, the world woke up to words like murder, violence, and disaster. The so-called Woodstock of the West was already being called the day the music died. News outlets replayed the chaos, broken bones, dozens of stabbings, 4 people dead, and of course the murder of 18-year-old Meredith Hunter. The image of him in his green suit lying lifeless became the symbol of everything that went wrong that night. For a nation that had celebrated Woodstock just months earlier, Altamont was like a slap in the face. Woodstock was supposed to prove that peace, love, and music could unite a generation. But Altamont showed the other side that all it took was poor planning, misplaced trust, and unchecked violence to tear that dream apart. Police and investigators moved quickly. Alan Pissarro, the Hells Angel, who stabbed Meredith, was arrested and charged with murder. But when the case went to trial, things weren't so simple. The defense argued self-defense, that Meredith had pulled a gun, and Pissarro had acted to protect himself and others. The grainy footage from Gimme Shelter was played again and again in the courtroom, dissected frame by frame. And in the end, the jury acquitted Pissarro. The stabbing, they decided, wasn't murder, it was survival. Meredith Hunter's family was left with no justice, just the haunting truth that his life had been reduced to a footnote in rock history. The Rolling Stones tried to distance themselves, but the guilt followed them. Many blamed them for hiring the Angels in the first place, for ignoring the warning signs, for pushing ahead when the crowd was clearly out of control. Altamont became a stain on their legacy, one they could never truly wash away. For America, Altamont was more than a concert gone wrong. It was a cultural turning point. The end of the 1960s dream. Peace and love had given way to violence and death. And people were left asking, was it all an illusion? Chapter 8. Lessons. Written in blood. Altamont didn't just scar the people who were there that night, it reshaped the entire music industry. Suddenly, promoters, bands, and even fans had to face a reality they had ignored for too long. Music festivals weren't just about peace and love. They were about logistics, safety, and responsibility. Before Altamont, concerts were often thrown together with little thought beyond the stage and the sound system. Woodstock had gotten lucky, chaotic, yes, but peaceful in the end. Altamont showed what happened when luck ran out. There were no barricades, no professional security, no emergency planning. And the result was 4 deaths, countless injuries, and 1 murder caught on camera. After Altamont, no one in the industry could pretend anymore. Suddenly, festivals required proper security, professional staff, medical teams, and tighter regulations. Rock and roll's free-spirited chaos had collided headfirst with reality, and from that point on, organizers were forced to take responsibility or face the consequences. Even artists began to change how they saw their role. Musicians had always wanted to connect with their fans, to break down the barriers between stage and audience. But Altamont showed that those barriers existed for a reason. When the crowd pressed too close, when security blurred with violence, when a band couldn't protect its fans, the dream became dangerous. The image of rock itself shifted. The Rolling Stones, once riding the wave of the counterculture, found themselves haunted by Altamont. For years, people asked if they had blood on their hands, and the truth is, in some ways, they did. Their decision to put the Angels in charge of security wasn't just careless, it was catastrophic. From that day forward, music was never again seen as untouchable or pure. Festivals became more corporate, more structured, less free, maybe less magical, but also in a way safer. Altamont was the warning that music could inspire joy or tragedy, and the industry never forgot it. Chapter 9. The Death of an Era. When people talk about the 1960s, they usually mention 2 defining concerts, Woodstock and Altamont. One represented everything hopeful about the decade, the other, everything broken. And that's why so many historians call Altamont the day the 60s died. Think about it, Woodstock had taken place just 4 months earlier. 500,000 people came together, endured rain, mud, and hunger. But somehow it stayed peaceful. It felt like proof that the counterculture was real, that a generation really could build a world on peace and love. But Altamont crushed that dream in a single night. Instead of unity, there was violence. Instead of peace, there was fear. Instead of freedom, there was death. For many, it was like waking up from a dream and realizing it was never as pure as they wanted to believe. The murder of Meredith Hunter became a symbol of shattered illusions. He wasn't just a kid at a concert. He was a black teenager killed in front of a mostly white crowd, and his death exposed cracks in the hippie movement that people didn't want to admit. It wasn't just violence. It was racial tension, social neglect, and a failure of the very ideals that had defined the decade. Altamont forced America to confront the dark side of the counterculture: drugs, disorganization, violence, and a blind faith that things would just work out. They didn't. And in the aftermath, the dream of the 1960s gave way to the cynicism of the 1970s. Altamont wasn't just a concert, it was a turning point. It told an entire generation that peace and love had limits. And when those limits were tested, the cost was blood. Chapter 10: A Legacy That Lingers. Even decades later, Altamont still casts a shadow. We remember it not as a concert, not even as a Rolling Stones performance, but as a cautionary tale, a moment when the dream of the 60s imploded in front of 500,000 witnesses. What makes Altamont so haunting is how familiar it feels even now: a lack of planning. Powerful people making reckless decisions, a community desperate for escape, but left vulnerable when safety is ignored. It's a story we've seen play out again and again in music festivals, in mass gatherings, in tragedies that might have been prevented if someone had cared enough to take responsibility. For Meredith Hunter's family, there was no justice. His name will always be tied to that night, even though he was more than a headline, more than a victim caught on film. He was an 18-year-old kid who loved music, who should have gone home safe, and who deserved so much better. Altamont reminds us that culture isn't just shaped by the good moments, it's defined by the tragedies too. Woodstock showed us what was possible, but Altamont forced us to see the dangers of blind faith. The dream was fragile, and when it cracked, the whole country felt it. Today, when we step into a stadium, a festival, or even a small venue, the lessons of Altamont are still there. Stronger security, tighter organization, and awareness of how quickly things can spiral. It doesn't erase the past, but maybe it prevents another Altamont from happening again. In the end, Altamont wasn't just the death of the 60s, it was a mirror. It showed us the cost of ignoring reality, of chasing an ideal, without recognizing the risks. And it left us with a question that still lingers: how many tragedies does it take for us to truly learn? And that's the story of Altamont, the festival that promised peace, but delivered tragedy. It was more than just a concert gone wrong. It was a turning point, a warning, a reminder that even dreams can bleed when reality catches up. Meredith Hunter's name deserves to be remembered not just as a victim in a headline, but as a young man whose life was stolen in a place that should have been safe. And the lessons of Altamont about responsibility, safety, and the dangers of blind trust still echo every time we gather in crowds today. Thank you so much for joining me for this journey into the darker side of history. If you found this story as haunting as I did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it. Helps bring these forgotten stories to light. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, the past has a way of repeating itself if we let it. Good night, friends.